So welcome. My name is Kim Harms, and I'm the president of the Delegation for Friendship Among Women. The delegation has been in existence for over 50 years, exploring in person the lives of women in 6 continents. We haven't made it to Antarctica yet. In light of our new reality of the limited travel, we are sharing our experiences virtually now. Welcome to our second webinar. You are going to be in for a big treat. Please mute your mics when you get on. And I just want to again welcome all of you for being here. It is now my great privilege to introduce Darlene Miller, who is our second vice president and entrepreneur extraordinaire. She was a host of our first webinar. So Darlene.
Thank you, Kim, and welcome everyone. And I am excited to introduce Dr. Carolyn Moats, who is a medical doctor at Mayo Clinic in Arizona. She actually did a residency at Mayo Clinic and medical school at Northwestern University in Chicago, and her Bachelor of Science in Nursing from the University of Michigan, and Master of Science from the University of Colorado. She is going to, along with Maro, do our program today, and we're super excited. And just a side note, she also wrote an article on domestic partner violence, and it was published in the Journal of Women's Health. And I've asked Carolyn to put that also on our website so that we can all read it, because I think it'd be very interesting. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Carolyn.
Thanks so much, Darlene. And we're so thrilled to have Maro Matosian here. We're really going to be talking about this pandemic within a pandemic, the pandemic of intimate partner and domestic violence in the time of COVID-19. And I'm so thrilled to have Maro Matosian here with us today. Some of us had the pleasure of meeting her in Georgia and Armenia on our trip in 2018. And she was the recipient of our Mary Pomeroy Award at that time. She's an activist and a feminist, and she's dedicated to the advancement of women in Armenia. In 2010, she founded the Women's Support Center in Yerevan to assist and empower women and children victims of domestic violence, as well as advocate for the defense of women's rights in Armenia. The center started with the help of the Armenian International Women's Association, the Terfekian Foundation, and USAID, and it offers comprehensive assistance with social workers, psychologists, and lawyers, and 2 shelters. And the shelter is run based on international standards and methodology for the victims of domestic violence. Maro underwent her training in the US and is one of the founding members of the Coalition to Stop Violence Against Women. She's authored numerous publications and guidelines. They're all aimed at improving domestic violence service in Armenia, and has presented at numerous conferences around the world. She was selected as an expert in the field by the Council on Europe to prepare a police guideline for working with cases of domestic violence, as well as a 3-year national action plan for combating domestic violence for the Ministry of Social Affairs. Maro's organization has trained 12 regional domestic violence support centers and is working on a training manual for social workers as well. And other than this, she's just a really wonderful person, and herself is just recovering from COVID-19. So thank you for doing this for us, Maro, and really appreciate it. And first of all, can we start out, can you really define domestic violence for us and maybe differentiate between intimate partner violence and domestic violence?
Yes, thank you first of all, Carolyn, and everyone for the kind words. Many people think that domestic violence is just a slap or an argument, and it's not. It's a pattern. It's continuous. It's repetitive, and it intensifies in its force. Domestic violence can end in death. And it can happen the first time the abuse occurs or after many, many years. Domestic violence also is cyclical, meaning that it starts with intensified anger, and then the violence, and then the honeymoon period. The honeymoon period is that when the abuser says, I'm sorry, it will never happen again, sometimes comes with gifts, and it's considered the most dangerous part of the abuse, because the victim always has hope, thinks that, okay, things will get better, things will not continue this way. But domestic violence over periods of time, it works like a trauma, like PTSD, and it affects the ability of, it affects, like trauma, it affects physically the victim and also mentally. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And many of you may ask why women stay in these relationships. You know, why can they come out? It's very complicated. It's very complex. Many times it's because they really love the partner, or the relationship started with love. There's children in play. Where will she go? There is economic dependency. There is the abuser really breaks her ego, her self-esteem, and she thinks that she's incapable of anything without him. It's really a pattern of controlling the victim to the point that she is incapable of making decisions, of thinking, having self-esteem, thinking that she can do something, thinking that she's worth something. And this all incapacitates her. At the shelter, where are the most complex and the most difficult, most dangerous cases, women, when we ask them, you know, what can you do? And they said that I can do nothing. I don't know anything. And slowly we bring it up through the empowerment methodology that yes, you can do. Yes, remember what were you doing before you got married? And slowly we bring out those traits or those skills that she might have, and she might have forgotten about it. And slowly they become to recover. But it's a very dangerous process, and the difference between intimate partner and domestic abuse is that domestic is between husband and wife, or a partner that acts like a husband. I mean, they don't have to be legally married, but if they live together. But we call it intimate partner because through the years, and I have to say that feminists started in the 60s, when the second wave of feminism started, and this is very interesting. When the second wave of feminism started, women were more talking about abuse against them than about equality. It's very interesting that that was the most, the strongest voice that were coming from women. And the feminists started on their own to open their homes to victims. And that became very dangerous because deaths have happened, and there was no security, no protection. But they did this on a volunteer basis. And slowly, social workers, psychologists, they started to look into this phenomenon that was not studied until then. So literally from the beginnings of the 70s, it took about 40 years to understand this process, to develop a methodology and legislation. And it really took about 40 years to do that. And we're still improving. It's not like it's a done deal. Because of an intimate partner, I want to say, it's because also of relationships that exist, but they're not really in a marriage situation. A lot of times abuse now is happening. We have teen abuse, dating abuse. Those are all offshoots of the domestic violence. And of course, we have child abuse. We talk about elderly abuse, the same pattern, and I'll talk about that, or people with disability. Everybody that can be belittled and subjected to abuse and violence. I mean, the weaker part. Karen, let me jump into it, and then I'd like to open it up. I made it a purposefully sort of shorter presentation so we can have the opportunity to hear your voices and your questions. Shall I start?
Yes. Well,
Okay.
do you want me to ask you some more questions first, or?
No, let me go through it, and
Okay,
then
all right.
in the end, I'll answer all the questions. Yes, of course. So COVID-19 has highlighted dangers for various vulnerable groups. Those particularly affected by inequality, and you know this because for more than a year, that's all we hear every day. Their healthcare, the distribution of vaccines, we know that it's not done based on equality. The level of education and children coming from poor families not having internet or computer, they're really most affected by this. Of course, the levels of unemployment, which are higher in the blue-collar workers, and the increase in hunger, in homelessness, and unemployment. To this, add another public health crisis, which is domestic violence. Mounting data suggests that domestic violence is acting like an opportunistic infection, flourishing in the conditions created by the pandemic. When we heard the slogan, "Stay home, stay safe," during this pandemic, we realized later the implications of it when it comes to domestic violence. Stay home, stay safe doesn't work when you're trapped at home with an abusive partner, and there is no safety. In fact, COVID-19 situation may make the situation even more dangerous for a variety of reasons. During a stay-home order, or now as we have working from home situations, the abuser is home all day long, day after day, in the house with the victim and their children. And such close proximity can increase tensions and make violence more likely. Possible loss of income from unemployment, the fear of getting sick, and the need to take on more responsibility for a 24/7 parenting and homeschooling. All this add as stress and anxiety, even for us that we're not abusers. You know, we do feel the stress from the pandemic. So, but for an abuser, it can trigger episodes of violence and even death. Victims lack social support, resources, and privacy to call for help, even more than at other times. Domestic violence is about power and control over the victim. In times when the perpetrator feels out of control in other parts of his life, you know, he loses his job, the insecurity, the uncertainty of it all. And during this time, domestic violence increases. The COVID-19 pandemic makes people feel out of control. We must all do our part to prevent what experts predicted and noticed to be a spike in domestic violence cases during the pandemic. What we know about domestic violence will only be more the case during this time. We already know that during times of crisis, instances of domestic violence increase. And this is same when you have natural disasters, war, a terrorist act, migration. All these are stressors that increase domestic violence. Such violence is not a one-time or occasional conflict or argument between husband and wife. Domestic violence is continuous and repetitive, as we talked, and acts of violence and threats that form a pattern and can end in death. In domestic violence, if domestic violence is already happening in the household, it will increase in intensity. If it did not occur yet, or the process is at the beginning stages, there may be acceleration of it. The goal for the abuser is to have power over the victim and make her his hostage so he can do as he pleases. And abusers have a sense of entitlement, and that's why the laws have to bring accountability to the abuser for his acts. The control is not only through physical violence. which most think that this is domestic violence, but it's also emotional, a lot of belittling, a lot of breaking her ego, basically. Sexual, which it can be manifested as forced sexual acts, doing things that the person does not want to do, or at times that she doesn't want to do, rape during marriage, in marriage, or even forcing her with other partners. We have seen that as well. And also economic abuse. And economic abuse is basically when he controls the money and she has to beg for it. So the whole process is to belittle her even more, even for the basic things like medicine or bread or diapers for the kids. In the process, he breaks her ego of the victim and her self-confidence, her self-esteem. All these are aspects and effects of trauma. And her power to make decisions and her strength to resist or escape. In the lockdown situation, the ability to escape is made all the more difficult. It must be pointed out that violence of any kind is never justified, as no one has the right to hurt or abuse another. So many have called this, during the lockdown, the situation in a domestic violence as intimate terrorism. And it really feels like intimate terrorism. When you're stuck at home with an abusive partner, under complete surveillance, can't even have the privacy in bathroom. Victims feel they are hostages, like in a kidnapping situation, constantly watched, must obey to every whim. For example, there was a case I read about where the partner was asking the woman to constantly wash her hands, constantly. I mean, not every hour, but constantly. She must obey his every whim. And it's also in total isolation from friends and family, which was obvious even before the virus, but increases more de facto during the virus. She's in constant fear of violence. And this is 24/7, with the abuser gives no time for a break. And victims have said that I'm his hostage to do as he pleases. So this is obviously a very traumatic experience for anybody. Also, it needs to be noted that there are other victims of domestic violence, such as the elderly or people with disability. And I mentioned the children. Such people are more at risk. And I have to say, with the child abuse, it's something that it's very difficult to discover, especially in underdeveloped countries where they don't have that system, the child protection system, the social services developed. And but we also notice now during the pandemic a high rate of suicide among children, among teenagers. And some of them are attributed not only to depression, but also to the abuse existent in those families. Such people, these vulnerable groups, are more at risk now that they have even less access to the outside world. We know of a grandmother whose son would beat her and not give her food, or a grandfather whose pension was taken away from him, and he was constantly belittled and verbally attacked by his son. What recourse would either of them have now if they are confined at home or they have to live with the abuser? It is very difficult for victims of domestic violence to reach out for help. In Armenia, for example, this is particularly a serious problem. Many victims do not have internet, not even a phone to call for help. And even if they did, they are too afraid to call the police. Now, with the stay-at-home order, the situation is even more acute. We know from victims who were able to escape that their situations during the stay-home order had worsened and became more dangerous. One such woman who managed to come to our center indicated that she did not have a phone to call. She was watched at all times and could not even go to the bathroom alone. Her husband watched her every move. He would lock her in the house when he went to work. This was before the pandemic. Now that he has been staying at home all day long, the situation became even more unbearable. She lived like this for 25 years. She never saw her family or anyone from the outside world. She did not know what money looked like, other than a 1,000-dram note, which is equivalent to $2. This woman worked for miles and miles to reach to a policeman. And that policeman said that, I don't know, he didn't know where to send her, what to do. So she worked even more. And there was a taxi driver that was able to bring her to a police station. But these women are really completely helpless. The domestic violence law in Armenia, which was recently passed, put into action in 2019, as well as numerous international conventions Armenia signed, consider domestic violence as a human rights violation. The law indicates that the societal response should be victim-centered, meaning that we must assist the victim in any way in order to provide safety and protection. Now, whatever is written on paper sounds very good, but putting it into action, it really takes a lot of practice, a lot of training, a lot of methodology that at all levels of society, they need to take into consideration. Domestic violence is such a phenomenon that, you have to work with educators, with people in the healthcare system, with the legal aspect, the courts, the police. So all of them, they have to be on their toes when it comes to recognizing and understanding what domestic violence is. But during the pandemic, the victim is not safe, and not only in the house, but outside of it as well, due to the virus. So many women would say, well, where will I go now? I take my children, and where shall I go? I will get infected, I might die. So there is that dilemma, where shall I stay or shall I go? So it makes it even more difficult for women. In developed countries, I'm talking about the Western world, they noticed a 30 to 50% increase in the hotline calls, WhatsApp or Facebook messages. In Armenia, we had about only 15% increase because I mentioned that women do not have access to internet or phones, and they are more isolated. And also they are not aware. Armenia has not yet had a public campaign to condemn domestic violence. So many people don't even understand what they go through, that this is domestic violence and is punishable by the law. At shelters, it's very interesting during the pandemic. Many places, they closed their shelter, even in the United States, and this is very dangerous for the victims. Because it's like an old age home, bringing a woman into the shelter, they might infect the other residents there and the staff. So what we were doing, we created a floor for new arrivals. And fortunately in Armenia, when you take the test, you receive the answer in 24 hours, which is better than here. But at least they do it faster. So that gives us some time. In the developed countries, France and Italy, for example, after the first week of the pandemic and the lockdown, the government put at the disposition of these women's centers hotel rooms, so they can bring the new arrivals that they should have gone to shelter to a hotel room until they get a negative test, and then they bring them to the shelter. We appealed the government for that, but we were not given that possibility. And I have to say that Western Europe is much better equipped to address domestic violence than even United States. In conclusion, I want to add that in situations like a pandemic or a disaster, society at large needs to be to have added sensitivity and understanding of domestic violence. Police, as the first responders, they must understand that they have to assure the safety and protection, but also they might act also as social workers, because the social worker herself may have not access to the victim. Or the access might be only through text messages or phone calls, and not on a one-on-one basis. There was an attempt, even in Armenia, to start court cases be put online, and policemen do the interrogation also through Zoom. But it did not last very long. And for a long period of time, the courts were closed down, and there was no legal activity. When we discuss about domestic violence globally, we have to make the distinction between, developed countries where at institutional level, the response is robust, and the ones like Armenia, who just started to address domestic violence. The resources are different, the level of knowledge is different, the institutional response is not there yet. So obviously we see the difference in both cases. But this is, as I mentioned, it's an added public health issue, domestic violence and domestic abuse in general in societies during the pandemic. Thank you. And I'm very glad to take your questions now.
Thanks so much, Maro. Just a couple of things that might be a little different here. I have talked to a few of the therapists that normally see people in person, and where women can talk about what's happening with them, and now they're only working virtually. And I said, I bet your business is up because of domestic, of being shut down and women, feeling more abuse. And they said their business is down because the abuser's in the next room. If you're
Exactly.
at home, you don't feel comfortable talking. And even on one Zoom call I had with someone, she was looking over her shoulder pretty much the whole call, because she wanted to talk about her home situation, but obviously didn't feel comfortable that somebody wasn't listening. And a Journal of Radiology study that was just published last month showed that between 2017 and 2019, they compared all of the injuries they saw then versus a comparable period in 2020, and they were much more severe injuries. By the time they came in, they felt that people were home much longer. They had more injuries and what they call deeper injuries during the time, if there was physical violence, that it was up 1.8 times previous, and the severity was more than doubled, just because women have been afraid to go out in the time of COVID-19 or put up with more because of that until they finally sought care. And I did a literature search, and there's a lot of studies going on, but it looks like every country is reporting it up. Every single country. India was saying 100%, China 3 times, Australia said 11%, but all of our methodologies are different. Every US study is different on it. And I think when we first talk about domestic violence, we think of well, that's not us, but one in 3 in the United States is thought to be a victim of intimate partner violence. So, we can just count down here, and none of us are exempt. It doesn't mean social, economic, financial status, they're all represented. And I see that all of the time. And I think how we are trained is we tend to think it's lower socioeconomic classes, and it is really across the board. Years ago,
Carolyn, if I may interrupt you, I want to mention something when you talk about socioeconomic classes, because there is this misconception that, or this myth that uneducated, poor families, but actually it happens all across the board. Domestic violence doesn't discriminate any, whatever religions you belong to, whatever political party you belong to, whatever social class you belong to, it hits you, it can hit you. And the fact is that people coming from upper middle class, they have much more difficulty to come out than the people from the poor sectors. And the reason for that, and the same thing in Armenia, believe it or not, the reason for that is that they cannot do away with their job, with their status, with their economic situation, their home. The children probably will not be able to go to the private classes they were going to, the insecurity of college education for the kids. So all this, there are factors, and the stigma of it, you know, what will the friends say, the neighbor, especially if the husband is somebody known and respected. Some people would say, we don't believe you. It's not possible because he is such a nice person outside of the home. So really, it's very difficult for these women to come out. I have to say that also when I'm lecturing around, I'm in United States, I was amazed how many women came up to me and say, you know, my sister, myself, my mother, my grandmother, they all knew somebody that was affected by this. And it's very difficult to come out and admit it. We should not force anybody to do that, but it can happen. And the only thing is that to know that there is help, and people can receive that help, and they don't deserve to stay, to be in an abusive relationship.
Absolutely. I think my eyes were opened many years ago when I was seeing an older woman, probably 70, and she just wanted to check up before she was going on a around the world cruise. And I said, oh, first time I ever saw this person, I said, how lovely. And I got a sense that something wasn't right. Blood pressure up, you know, just her entire demeanor. And I ended up spending about 90 minutes and found out she was terrified to be in, even though it was a suite in a luxury liner going around the world for like 6 months. She was terrified because she had like a 10,000 square foot house where she could get away from her husband. But to be in a suite on a ship was terrifying to her in those confines. And that really opened my eyes, I think, to all different classes. But you've given us some great information, and let's get some questions here from the group.
So if anyone has questions, they can just unmute themselves for the question. And Carolyn, I think you have some other questions too, if we're a little slow to get them.
You said that Europe was doing better on domestic violence laws than America. What are they doing?
Well, I think Europe in general has a much more robust services and response to domestic violence. Society is much better aware and prepared for those things, and the level of protection is much bigger, I think, less bureaucratic. You know, we have a federal system, and I noticed that in each state, the response is different. We don't even have a homogeneous response in the United States. And also, because we have different mentalities in this country, for example, the worst state with the highest rates of femicide is South Carolina. And South Carolina, because of their patriarchic society, and which gives entitlement to men, and the police taking sides with the men and offering less protection to women, that's why there the level of domestic violence is much higher, and even deaths. The best place is Massachusetts, by contrast, which they have organizations that work on the multi-sectoral level, the police together with the protective centers, with the schools, with the municipalities. So they have a all broader system of addressing this, and also dealing with the most, for example, England, it has a system, a task force for those very complex cases. The difficulty in the Western world is that many of these women suffering from PTSD and having a way to cope, they go into drugs or alcoholism. And that is much more difficult to rehabilitate them. We don't have that problem in Armenia, thank God, so far. But that's very difficult to rehabilitate them. And many of these women end up from shelter to shelter because they cannot maintain a job, they cannot take care of their children. So in this task force in London works with various agencies, let's say, to be able to work and put this woman into a functioning state in society. We don't have that here. This model we don't have. It involves, of course, a lot of input from the state, but eventually it's cheaper on society, less expensive that way, to be able to rehabilitate somebody and not be on the shoulders of the government. Yes.
It's all very difficult to care for these people and treat them and so forth. But what about prevention? I think, I don't know what the statistics are, but I think there's a very high percentage of people who are abused that do the abusing. Is there anybody who's looking at prevention of becoming a perpetrator? And
yeah, it's a very valid question. I mean, before you go into the problem, you think of preventing it, right? So yes, prevention involves many things. Prevention involves awareness of the problem, education on the problem. Prevention involves training of service providers, and also the reasons for domestic violence. Let's start from there. The cause of domestic violence. It's a patriarchic society where men are entitled, men make the laws, men decide, you know, the usual.
the usual.
Yeah. And then there are gender stereotypes, and the gender stereotypes are what feed into the patriarchy, meaning that the woman is less capable, she is weak, she is not, you know, all the things, and the man is the one that is the head of the household and is entitled for everything. He's smarter, he's brighter, he's all that. So one thing to, and also the culture of violence, the third aspect of it, the culture of violence, meaning that throughout our media, in our society, for example, in Armenia, many times arguments end up in fistfights. That's an aspect of violence. In the United States, people have guns and they use them, you know, or threaten with them. All these aspects, I mean, the culture of violence, or in the media, what we see on television, everything, that we normalize violence in a way. All these aspects are factors for domestic violence. So if you go the reverse, that you go towards a more equal society, where men and women respect each other. So if you promote those things, if you fight against patriarchy and gender stereotypes, that's in schools everywhere. I'll give you an example. In Armenia, we try to do this awkwardly, but at least they try to do it. They're cognizant that they have to do it. So for example, in a classroom situation, they talk about, respect and this and that, and that the girls can do things also like boys. And then when the bell strikes, then there is the recreation period, the teacher will say, girls, stay here and clean the board, the blackboard. So in other words, the menial job is given to the girls and it destroys everything, all that was taught in the class. So one way of prevention is to have a more equal society where there are no gender stereotypes, where we teach our girls that they are entitled to respect. We empower our girls to feel that they are capable of things and nobody has the right to belittle them or abuse them. So it's a matter of education on one thing. It's a matter of changing societal norms. For example, in South Carolina also. By the way, also it was noticed, there was an article about in New York, Staten Island has a high degree of domestic violence. Why? Because in Staten Island, the majority of men, they're either policemen or firefighters. And people with authority, men with authority, they're also more abusive. In United States, there is very good legislation that protects, that punishes people that have abuse they're abusive as a policeman, because that's very dangerous. And also training people, service providers, because if you can detect something early on, you avert the situation to happen later on. Or increase the abuse further on. So training of service providers is very, very important, and detecting. And we have this in schools, we can detect. If something happens, we can call the social worker. They can look into it, their methods of how to deal with it. I have to say that sometimes it's very difficult because the victim doesn't want anything and we cannot force anybody. So it takes a time for them to become, to take that step to come out of the relationship.
Thanks.
Diane?
Yes,
Are
go
you
ahead.
calling on us or
Yeah, go ahead.
you pointed out something maybe inadvertently, and that is that those who are the first responders can also be the abusers.
Mm-hmm.
And with all the movement in this country about the police and with police violence, and there is a move afoot in some places to restructure the police and have them not be the first responders and have social workers or other people who are trained. And I'm wondering, that's question one, what you think of that. And number two, what does little old me or someone who is confronted with a situation where they know this exists, what can one do?
Mm-hmm.
And particularly in a situation, as you pointed out, perhaps a middle or upper income person who just isn't really very willing to even admit that it's going on, much less to find help. But what can someone do?
Well, let me start from the easiest, perhaps. In domestic violence, even a social worker, it needs to be an anchor. It's somebody to lean on, for the victim to lean on. Not a person to make decisions for the victim, not a person to tell her what to do. She can, as a social worker, you raise questions, you give information for the victim to make choices, to make decisions. As a non-professional, as a friend, let's say.
You don't have to put it on. Just hold it.
Yeah, I think somebody has to be on mute. Yeah.
Carol, can you mute?
Yeah. So for somebody that is a friend, and you say, if it's obvious, something is obvious, I understand you're going through a very difficult time. You can tell me, this will be completely confidential. if you want, I will try to help. Basically, offer whatever assistance, offer that you will help, that you will try to help, and mention, especially mention, you do not deserve this. Because they have to make their decision. They say that there are centers that they can help you. There are places to go, and you do not deserve this. You have to listen more than speak. And when you listen, just nod for them to understand that you follow them and you do not bored, because they can be repetitive. Sometimes they can tell their story jumping by decades. It's not a continuous narrative or a chronological narrative. They remember what it comes to their mind. Just be understanding. You are not a professional social worker, therefore you do not have to deal with anything or to solve anything or to find solutions to everything, but make them understand that there are others who can help them out, and she doesn't deserve this. That's all you can do, nothing more. Do not say, you might say that if you are in danger, call the police, but you cannot do anything more than that. Regarding to police, when it comes to domestic violence, I would say that the police force is so much needed, because many times the abuser becomes very, when he sees the policeman, it's a restraining force. It's a restraining mechanism, even seeing the policeman. I would not recommend for social workers to go into the domestic violence household. Many times the guns they're shooting right there. Social workers, usually they do house calls, they visit the homes, but not in the abuse cases. It's very dangerous. So definitely, and many times in the news, if you observe that there was a shooting at somebody's house, but they don't mention that it can be because of domestic violence. So many times there was a household, we got a call from a household, there was an incident, and there was a shooting of the policeman. But they don't say that it is because of domestic violence. So, I mean, it can very well be drugs. I'm not saying no, but an incident where police was called usually is not drugs, it's domestic violence. So what is in other cases, I do agree that a social worker is better than a policeman. In cases of domestic violence, definitely a policeman. And policemen in the Western world, they usually go in pairs. It's a woman and a man, usually that they go into the domestic violence situation, and they both interview. They can maybe one of them takes the kids aside and ask the kids some questions. They're trained to do this, and the report, in other words, in the field of work, I don't think that the policeman will cover up for the abuser, but we don't know what happens to that policeman in his home. That's the difference. Yeah.
I think I saw Pete had a question.
Yes, first of all, thank you very much. I think, the first step everybody takes to fixing a problem is talking about it, and you've certainly done that. So thank you for that. And you've answered a lot of the questions that I had when I was sort of first hearing you by other people asking. One of the things that came to mind is you never waste a crisis, and we have a crisis. So is there something now that, the voices can do, or anything, it's basically what Julie also asked, what can we do? How do we prevent this? But is there something on the heels of the crisis that we're in now that could project this forward a little bit?
To tell you frankly, I don't know what, we live in such isolation that we don't interact anymore with the centers that we used to interact. So I don't know if they have changed their response and what can they do more. But I know that they're much more online whenever they can, and there is and resources available. As I mentioned, how do you make a shelter work instead of closing it down in fear of contamination? So making a shelter work, having hotel rooms so you can isolate the person and make sure that that she tests negative so she can be brought to the shelter. It's very difficult, and I have to say that in United States, being a big country, many times dangerous cases, what they do is they relocate the person to another state, another shelter. And usually the shelters, unlike those in Armenia, where the security is very difficult to provide in Armenia, and it's a small country, people sort of know each other. We in United States, many times the person in the shelter can go out and work, and going out working and coming back to the shelter, the possibility of infecting somebody in the shelter is much higher. So I know that some universities, they do for their students twice a week, they do testing to see if they have infections, if they're COVID positive. Maybe mechanisms like that can be put in place for the domestic violence shelters. It has to do with resources, because the most important thing is to have the shelters open. Those are the cases that can end up in death, and you want to prevent that.
It sounds like they would really be a priority for vaccination.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we talk about, I'm not sure whether the shelter staff and inhabitants are part of the group to be vaccinated. I know the old age homes are, but I wonder if these shelters are part of that. That's something to promote or advocate for.
It's state by state.
Yeah.
And it's interpreted slightly differently in every state in the United States.
Yeah. Any other questions? It's interesting that you didn't ask me something that I'm always asked in Armenia, being a very patriarchal society. What about the abuser? Who takes care of the abuser? The poor man, So who works with the abuser? Well, there've been developed programs to work with the abuser in United States and in Europe. However, we had a study which is on our website, and it's in English as well. The methodology used for this abuser perpetrator program, that's what it's called, perpetrator program, they don't have a definitive answer that they are successful. The place that is most advanced in the United States and had advanced the study of domestic violence is Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth Center developed also the power and control wheel, which you call it, of the aspects of domestic violence, the physical abuse, how it's manifested, the psychological, the economic, the sexual, all the coercion and all that. Stalking also, it's another aspect of domestic violence. I have to say that there is no data on their success. However, it works somehow it works. For example, in the United States, you have probation, and an abuser can not go to jail, go to these perpetrator programs, And the probation officer with the perpetrator program instructor, they stay in communication to see how responded and how willing is that individual to change. And based on that, on his behavioral changes, and they monitor that. He is in contact with the victim, he wants to see the children, and he's allowed to see the children only if he makes progress. So that's a way of perhaps more controlling, but not really changing the abuser. We don't know. We don't know, and there is no data that it's like alcoholism. 5 years you stay free of alcohol, and then maybe you relapse in the 6th year. And domestic violence is something like that. And when I mentioned the reasons for domestic violence, I forgot to mention one thing, that children that have been abused in their childhood, the girls tend to, or come from domestic violence families, the girls tend to marry abusers and the boys become abusers. So that's another aspect. And also, especially with, with everybody, when the abuse has occurred in childhood, and a trauma occurred in childhood, and that was not dealt with at that time, we call it, this is a complex trauma, because they enter into adult life, and in their adult life, another trauma happens, which is domestic violence or sexual abuse. So, and at that point, it's very difficult to rehabilitate that person, because we did not deal with the trauma of the childhood. So that's always lingering. It's a much more complex psychological intervention that is required at that time. And we cannot force people to come constantly. I mean, we had a case where the woman did not want to see the psychologist because it would bring back all those bad memories that she had from her childhood, and she didn't want to deal with it. So those are very complex issues, yes.
Maro, when this group was in Cuba, I'm thinking it was about 10 years ago, a few of us went over to the University of Havana and kind of had an informal speaking session with the gender studies master's students. And I was expecting it to be a female group. It was by and large mostly men in the gender study master's program. And I thought, what a wonderful way to really be a preventive grassroots effort against, things like domestic violence and when men are being educated on that level. It was interesting at the time, they didn't actually, the country did not acknowledge that they had a domestic violence problem. Shortly after that, they did, but I think they knew by really fostering the men in the gender studies graduate programs.
Yeah, it's interesting because Armenia was also in the Soviet Union, a republic of the Soviet Union. And in the Soviet Union, I mean, all the communist countries, the idea is that they have a perfect society and all the problems exist in the West. They don't have any problems. And they were able to cover up that very well and never mention in the media or in the press or on television cases of abuse, homicides, rapes or anything like that. When independence occurred, a flood of the social ills took over. And the country was unprepared to deal with because they did not have social workers who were trained properly as social workers. They didn't have psychologists who knew what that was, those child abuse, domestic violence, that type of thing. And they didn't know how to deal with the problem. And to this day, we have a lot of problems of finding proper personnel, professionals to handle this. And with domestic violence, you really have to have a feminist perspective. You really have to believe in women, in the empowerment of women, in the right for equality, because otherwise it just doesn't go right with domestic violence if you think that the man is entitled for everything. So yes, it's a big problem. But I question Carolyn. I'm not sure that those men were all feminists and they were all willing to, maybe it was a easy place for them to get a degree. I doubt it very much that they were motivated by knowing how to deal with domestic violence. And to tell you frankly, they were not the men. When you talk to a woman, for example, in the perpetrator program, men, usually they work in couples, a woman and a man as instructors. But when it comes to the victims, and the vast majority is, they say 95%, if not more, are women, victims of domestic violence, it's a woman counselor that has better success because the victim would open up to a woman rather than a man. Especially when she has to talk about sexual violence and those things. So I'm not sure that a class of men would have been able to address this. And I wonder if they knew what they were talking about. I mean, what type of gender studies that would have been. Because the gender studies has been developed primarily in the United States first. And I'm not sure that they would have adopted in Cuba, United States curriculum.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's interesting, nevertheless.
Maro, hi Carolyn, it's Mary.
Thank you, Mary.
Hi, everyone. Mary. Maro, I'm certain that I'm never going to forget my visit with you at your shelter. It's like many of the delegation experiences, it's life-changing. And I think about it so much. I think about the children's rooms that you had set up and how happy they were. I think about the women we saw that day. They didn't feel ashamed, or they knew, we were visiting. They looked happy and safe.
Yeah.
That's all because of you.
Well, yeah, believe me, when they first come, they are scared every time the door opens.
I know. And then I remember that you showed Carolyn and me and a couple others your storage units and how many suitcases were in there, because they come in with nothing.
Yeah.
When you're ready to launch them out, they need something for their clothes and their belongings. That'll always stick with me. If I remember correctly, you had a very, very strong connection with a US-based private foundation. And I'm curious, has that continued for you?
Yeah, well, up to COVID.
And the second question is whether or not it has, how can we support you?
Oh, thank you. Yeah, up to COVID, I had been involved with the center that trained me, Jersey Battered Women Services. But because of COVID, to tell you frankly, I'm not getting out of the house a lot, and I'm not sure that they are willing to interact with me. But I'm in touch, with via webinars and all sorts with other places in throughout the world that deal with this issue, and we constantly stay informed, and information is constantly coming up. To tell you the good news is, Mary, is that we opened 2 shelters, which are brand new locations, much bigger and much happier, much lighter, luminous, and with a bigger capacity. In terms of help, again, I have some good news as well. This is not COVID cost, Carol. This is post-nasal drip. I know how to differentiate now. The state of Armenia now has taken that they have to subsidize these NGOs who became centers of domestic violence, and also the shelters. So 10% of our budget is subsidized by the state now, which is a very good welcome. But of course, you know, they want all sorts of very bureaucratic and very non-professional, like they want to know the names of the, you can come to our office, you can study, but we're not sending this information via emails or internet. Or and as you know, shelters are always an issue of financing, because you really have to provide everything, whatever it's a household you can think of, from toilet paper to nail clips to everything, sanitary pads, diapers, clothes, bras, underwear, everything you have to produce, plus the food, the utilities, and the hygienic products, washing detergents, and so forth and so on. So obviously, it's a funding issue that we deal with, and that is the place where we need most support. Because we receive grants from international organizations, but they don't deal with our core expense, operational expense. They deal with trainings, developing studies, those I can put some of that money I can allocate towards the social workers or towards the lawyers or the psychologists. But in terms of the shelter, there is absolutely no money coming from international organizations for the functioning of the shelters. And that's all stays on us. And as I mentioned, 10% is the government. And we continue, to tell you frankly, whenever I go to Armenia, even though I have an apartment there and with my clothes are there, I carry 2 suitcases full of donated clothes, and we do collects in Armenia of used clothes, because they always need it. Even kitchenware, plates, spoons, mugs, all that, it's needed for a family that goes to a place that it's empty.
It's interesting because you mentioned Staten Island in your words, and I had an assistant that lived in Staten Island, and she was married to a police officer. And your comments really made me think about it. She invited all of us, there's like maybe 12 of us, to her home, which is a very small sort of brownstone in Staten Island, for a Christmas party. And the entire downstairs level was it was his den, it was his place. And I, not knowing any of this, I brought a little housewarming gift which said, a man's castle is his own until the queen arrives, because she's, really powerful person on the trading floors. And that was just so not the thing to do. It completely set off something else that I never understood until now.
Yeah.
That it was his space and he's the guy in charge. But you're reminding me of something that I had been wondering about for many years.
Yeah. Men in power tend to be very authoritative, very controlling. Women can bear it, but sometimes it becomes unbearable. So it's his rules. The house, it's his domain. Yeah.
And I think Julie had one more comment to make.
I was just writing there. I read somewhere that, and I cannot recall where this was, but that when there are sort of peer-to-peer situations where men make it known to other men that domestic or intimate violence is not acceptable, that there's a notable reduction in violence against partners.
Right. I'm aware in Massachusetts of a program that men started, and the municipality there supports it, and they have some joint program where they, every year, there's a date, a specific date where they use the white ribbon, and they have this white ribbon on their lapel, and that's a time where men advocate against domestic violence and for gender equality. And these campaigns are really very helpful, particularly to young men, to teenage boys. It's very important that. And there you can make a difference because, you know, the saying boys will always stay boys, that it's not really, we should not think in those terms all the time, you know. And when I trained the policemen in Armenia, it's interesting because I was talking about, you know, combating gender stereotypes. And one way to combat the gender stereotypes is not to make everything blue and pink, you know, in the sense that we should not divorce the two sexes and say that, oh, you're girls, you're gonna play only with this, and you're about. And this policeman was very angered at me. He said, what do you mean that we should, instead of giving a little gun to the boy, we're gonna put lipstick on his lips? And I said, I didn't talk about lipstick. What I'm saying is that you should allow for boys and girls to choose their toys, and also encourage educational toys. You know, you can do drawings and puzzles and other things, not segregate it like that, and make it absolutely, you know, and many times I see that, and you can, parents, you know, well, he's a boy, he has to be like that. And if he, you notice probably sometimes parents, if the boy hits somebody else, okay, he's entitled, that's okay. But
it's like any group, if you call attention to their similarities rather than differences, they're much more likely to be
absolutely,
with
absolutely.
each other, yeah.
Or you are a boy, you should not cry. And that the fact that boys and young men cannot express their feelings, it's also because of the gender stereotypes, it's very detrimental to them, to their mental health. So you know, it's really an educational issues. And and the more we are cognizant of the issues, of the problems, the more as parents we can be different. And if we are as parents different in raising our children, then they will, in their turn, will be able to be much more understanding of their partners. I want to mention one thing, so because we talk about partners, domestic violence also occurs in lesbian and homosexual relationships, and they are much more difficult to detect. And I was watching a training video from Los Angeles, and one of where, and they have captions, they have little sketches. Well, how the police deals with the perpetrator that is a policeman and has a gun on him. How he deals with a lesbian couple. How he deals when there are children involved. So it was a very interesting training program. But many times policemen are not prepared to deal with this, entering in the relationship. But the same abusive dynamic exists into same-sex relationships as well. And there are many, much more difficult to for them to go to the police because many times they are laughed upon, they're not understood, and it's much more difficult. I'm very thankful for all the great questions you're asking.
Any other questions that people have? This has really been wonderful, Maro. Just really appreciate you doing this for us, and wishing you health and thank you for all what you do for women. It's just amazing. We have so much to learn.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult for me because I work in a very patriarchal society, and where the legislation and the institutions are not up to par. Whereas here, it's very much of a blessing because you get the police protection as workers, as you know, the shelter, the center that I here in New Jersey that I work with or I frequent, it's you can tell the difference of an abundant neighborhood and one that is not. And they told me about this. For example, they have a transitional home for those women who still need to get on their own feet, and there is much hope that they will be able to become independent and on their own feet. So the transitional home is basically an apartment where two women live together. So and they're given everything new, you know, bedding, clothes, everything that they need and that they can take with them. I mean, these are donated by the people in the county, and they take that with them at home. So it's a huge difference. Whereas in a poor neighborhood, the facility is not very well kept, and the possibility of donations are much limited. And when we visited I visited in Boston, the first shelter in the United States. Of course, been renovated and expanded and everything. And Mary, if you want to see a children's room, I suggest you see that children's room. My God, they had everything. And
where was that in Boston?
In Cambridge.
Cambridge.
Yeah. And there is a book, I'll try to find the title of it, which is a very fascinating book about how this came about. And it was a woman who was a prostitute and another woman, an immigrant, who they were themselves abused and forced into prostitution because she couldn't gain her living. And they opened this first shelter and they become activists, and one of them is still on the board. It's a fascinating book, and that documents the history of the domestic violence and how it progressed and where they reached, and the challenges that they faced, because it was now we know how to do it. We don't have to reinvent the wheel, but at that time in the early 70s they didn't know, and they started as volunteers. They started from their own apartment, and the challenges when you have to have a board, when you have to have a manager, when they're becoming paid, the expectation of the paid employees, all this created a lot of challenges. But coming back, that shelter, the conditions that they had a huge refrigerator only for two women. So each two women, they had their own refrigerator. Now, to tell you frankly, I'm a bit against lavish or high-end shelters, as I call them, because of five-star shelters, because the majority of women, especially in Armenia, they will go back living poor. And you don't want to create this shock from everything that is offered. Women that come in our shelter, they never had a washing machine. And they will go to a situation that there will be no washing machine. So even though we need to have a washing machine, but I don't want to create, it's a very simple existence, it's table and sofa and bed and a night table. That's it, nothing extra, because we don't want to create this huge shock when they go back to their own living. Yeah. I will try to send Carolyn the name of that book, and it is fascinating. And then there was another book I read of 10 cases of violence where they explain very well through testimony of typical what is it's a physical, what it's a psychological, economic, and sexual violence, and that's something that that depicts it very well for you to understand all the implications of violence, because people cannot imagine how it and to tell you frankly, the best training I received was from my survivors, from the victims themselves. You know, until you do not work with the victims, you do not understand exactly what domestic violence is. And many times I'm faced with this theoreticians, especially at the UN, and who never worked with victims of domestic violence, and they try to tell us, you know, you have to do this or you have to do that. I said, well, you know, it's different when you work with them.
Well, Maro, I know we've kept you over your time that we said, and unless anyone has any other burning questions or comments, I think we should let Maro go here.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Carolyn.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Carolyn.
Great. You all.
Thank
Nice to
you.
see you, Carolyn.
Thank you, Maro.
Thanks so
Thank you.
much.
Thank you.
And on behalf of the Delegation for Friendship Among Women, I invite all of you to share your ideas or contacts you may have for future webinars. And thanks all of you for attendance, and goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.